Prince Edward Hartwell was 42 years old when he realized he could remember every criticism his father had ever given him, but not a single compliment. The realization came unexpectedly during a state dinner. As heir to the throne, Edward had spent decades representing the crown with the calm confidence expected of a future king. He had negotiated treaties, managed crises, and carried responsibilities that would have overwhelmed most people. To the public, he appeared accomplished, respected, and entirely self-assured. Yet that evening, while listening to a visiting diplomat praise his leadership, Edward found himself thinking about his father, King William Hartwell. A man admired throughout the kingdom. A man who had dedicated his entire life to duty. A man who loved his family deeply. And a man who had never once said the words Edward had spent his entire life hoping to hear. "I am proud of you." As a child, Edward had always assumed the words would come eventually. Perhaps after a successful school year. Perhaps after his first military achievement. Perhaps after graduating from university. Then after his engagement. Then after the birth of his daughter. Then after years of loyal service to the crown. But the years kept passing. The words never came. Whenever Edward succeeded, his father simply moved on to the next responsibility. Whenever he failed even slightly, the king noticed immediately. Not because he was cruel, but because he believed it was his duty. A future king, he often said, must always strive to improve. As a boy, Edward had accepted that explanation. As a man, he wasn't so sure. Several weeks later, King William suffered a mild stroke. The doctors assured the family that he would recover, but they insisted he slow down and avoid unnecessary stress. For the first time in decades, the king found himself confined to his private residence with little to do except rest. Edward began visiting more often. At first, their conversations remained polite and predictable. They discussed government affairs, charitable projects, upcoming events, anything except their relationship. Then one rainy afternoon, while helping organize paperwork in his father's study, Edward discovered an old leather notebook hidden inside a locked drawer. He had no intention of reading it. Until the notebook slipped from his hands and opened on the floor. A loose page slid free. Edward bent down to retrieve it, then froze. Because written across the top was a date, 30 years old. And beneath it were words that immediately caught his attention. Edward gave his first public speech today. The handwriting belonged to his father. Slowly, Edward continued reading. He was nervous beforehand but never showed it. "I have never admired him more." His father had written the word admired. The room suddenly felt smaller. Carefully, he turned another page. And another. Each entry described a different moment from his life. His first day at military academy, his wedding, the birth of his daughter, his first diplomatic success. Again and again the same pattern appeared: praise, pride, affection. All written privately. Never spoken aloud. Edward sat down heavily in his father's chair. For several minutes, he couldn't move. Because the notebook revealed something he had never imagined. His father had been proud of him all along. That evening, Edward returned home carrying a question he could no longer ignore. Why had the king found it easier to write those words to a notebook than to his own son? And more importantly, would he ever get the chance to ask? For 2 days after discovering the notebook, Edward carried it with him everywhere. Not because he intended to confront his father immediately. Because he couldn't stop reading it. Every spare moment seemed to pull him back to those pages. Again and again, he found himself opening the worn leather cover and searching through years of entries written in the king's unmistakable handwriting. Some were only a few lines long. Others stretched across several pages. Yet every one of them revealed a version of his father Edward had never known. There were notes about his first day at military academy, entries describing his university graduation, observations about his wedding, the birth of his daughter, his first major diplomatic success. Each page contained pride, admiration, affection. Everything Edward had spent a lifetime hoping to hear. Everything that had remained trapped inside a notebook instead. The discovery brought comfort. But it also brought anger. Not the sharp anger of betrayal. The quieter kind. The kind that emerges when a person realizes they have spent decades carrying a burden that never needed to exist. One evening, unable to ignore the feeling any longer, Edward returned to the king's residence, carrying the notebook beneath his arm. His father was sitting beside the fireplace when he arrived. The king glanced up from his newspaper. "You look determined." For several seconds neither man spoke. Finally, William sighed. "So you found it." The silence that followed felt heavier than any argument. "I didn't mean to read it," Edward said. "I know." For the first time in his life, he looked less like a monarch and more like an elderly man who suddenly seemed tired. "I don't understand." Yet years of unanswered questions sat beneath the. "You wrote all of this?" "Yes." "Then why didn't you ever say it?" The king stared into the fire for a very long time before answering. When he finally spoke, his voice sounded quieter than Edward had ever heard it. "Because my father never said it to me." The king gave a short laugh. Not a happy one. "When I graduated from military academy, he shook my. When I married your mother, he nodded once and changed the subject. When I became king, he told me not to disappoint the country." The pieces were beginning to fit together. The king smiled sadly. "I spent my entire life believing that was how fathers loved their sons. I thought providing for you was enough." For the first time, Edward stopped seeing only his father. He saw a young prince who had once sat exactly where he was sitting now. A son who had also waited for words that never came. A boy who eventually became a man and unknowingly passed the same silence to the next generation. The realization softened something inside him. The wound was still there. But suddenly it belonged to more than one person. Several weeks later, the royal family gathered for the king's 75th birthday. Children filled the gardens. Grandchildren chased each other across the lawns. Laughter echoed through the palace grounds. As evening approached, family members assembled for a private celebration inside the ballroom. Speeches were expected. Tradition demanded it. Edward assumed his father would thank the guests, offer a few remarks, and end the evening as he always did. Instead, the king stood slowly and looked around the room. His expression seemed unusually thoughtful. The conversations faded. The room grew quiet. Then William spoke. "When people reach my age, they begin thinking about legacy. For many years, I believed legacy was about duty. Service." Then something changed in his expression. A softness rarely seen in public. "But I've come to realize that legacy is also the things we leave unsaid." The king turned fully toward him. And for a brief moment, neither of them seemed aware of anyone else in the room. "I spent too much of my life believing that love could be assumed. That the people closest to us already knew how we felt. Others seemed to understand exactly where this was going." The king's eyes never left his son's. "Edward, I should have said this many years ago." Then at last William spoke the words both of them had waited a lifetime to hear. "I am proud of you." For a moment the room seemed to disappear entirely. Edward looked at his father and saw tears gathering in the older man's eyes. The king smiled. A small, tired smile. "You became a better man than I ever was." Not because the words erased the past. They didn't. But because they finally gave a name to something he had spent 40 years wondering. And sometimes that is enough. The applause that followed was gentle. Almost secondary. Because the moment did not belong to the crowd. It belonged to a father and son who had finally found the courage to say what should have been said decades earlier. 1 year later, when King William passed away peacefully in his sleep, the entire nation mourned. During the memorial service, Edward stood before the country as heir to the throne and spoke about his father's life. Near the end of the speech, he paused, then smiled. "My father taught me many things. The most important lesson came very late." A boy who watched him with the same admiration Edward had once felt toward his own father. And in front of the entire nation, Edward said, "I am proud of you." And perhaps that was the greatest legacy King William left behind. Not a throne. Not a title. But a wound that finally stopped being passed from father to son. If this story touched your heart, tell us in the comments. And if you believe it's never too late to say the words that matter most, don't forget to like, subscribe, and join us for more unforgettable royal stories of family healing, forgiveness, and second chances.